So today's talk on sentience and AI, I will begin by defining many terms that are relevant to the discussion here. Obviously, this is a very nascent field. And in addition to being a very nascent field, it's also a very intricate and complicated field, especially to speak about a topic which is being currently debated and discussed across many different disciplines, across computer science, across neuroscience, across philosophy, theology. Everyone is debating this issue. So it's not something that I feel that I can give any type of definitive conclusions. But here, what we would like to do is to present some theological and philosophical considerations of how we as Muslims can understand this particular hot topic of understanding consciousness and artificial intelligence. First, we want to make a distinction between two major classifications of artificial intelligence on a very broad level. Weak AI is what is the current AI system that is designed to do a particular task. It is what is found in your smartphone, in things like Apple Siri, Alexa, so on and so forth. So that is the current form of artificial intelligence. In addition, there's strong AI, what is called strong AI, which refers to an AI system that pretty much can mimic every type of human cognitive ability. When presented with any type of unfamiliar task, it has the ability or enough intelligence to find a solution. So as of right now, we have not reached strong AI. And the debate surrounds this issue of, can we even reach strong AI? Is that even possible? And so what I found very early on in my preparation for this presentation is that there's a lot of debate on defining what exactly does it mean to be sentient, or the idea of being aware or capable, sensing, feeling, awareness, consciousness. All of these it's a very multifaceted word with different connotations. Ultimately, what it's trying to get at is to understand what is life. How do we define life? Is life something that we can define? If so, how should we go about defining life? If strong AI appears to be a replication of human cognitive abilities, is it alive? Can we say such a thing? What does it mean to be alive? When I looked into the books of our scholars, Muslim scholars, one of the definitions I came across was quite surprising, but nevertheless something that I feel that all of us could relate to, which is Ar-Raghib al-Isfahani, rahimahullah. He mentions that life, the understanding of life is actually self-evident. There's nothing really to define per se. An individual understands when he comes across another individual who is alive versus a rock per se, or something that is inanimate. However, on the other side, I also came across definitions that seem to indicate that the matter is not all that simple. And here we have a quote from Ibrahim al-Laqani, who said that the people recognized, meaning the scholars recognize, the difficulty in providing information for the explanation of life and in expressing that definition for it. They instead chose to explain life as it's whatever is entailed by it. They chose to instead explain life by what is entailed by life. What are the traces of life? What are the marks of life, as opposed to defining life in and of itself? So having said that, we're going to discuss a couple of philosophies that are found in modern philosophy of mind, and then correlate and correspond that to what we found our own theological scholars of Islam mentioning. And then from there, we'll go on to discussing a couple of theological implications. So the first philosophical idea that I want to explain is something known as functionalism, which is basically a belief that it stresses on the practical application of a thing. In short, what it's basically saying is, we don't really care about the process or how things are done. We're just going to simply look at the output. If the output is the same, then the two things in comparison can be regarded as one and the same. So for example, in the philosophy of mind, there's a thing called the Turing test. And the way this Turing test works is, you have an interrogator, which is the one at the bottom, player C. And you have a computer, and then you have a human responder. If the interrogator, who is communicating with both the computer and human responder, cannot differentiate between the two, then that would entail that functionally there is nothing different between the computer and the human responder. So this is the idea of strong AI. If we can get to a point where a human cannot differentiate if he is speaking to a human, a fellow human, or a computer, then strong AI has been essentially reached. So this is the Turing test to determine when we have reached that point. And clearly, the Turing test is looking at the end outcome, the end output. What is the end result? Not paying attention to how the computer has gotten there, but to see if it can mimic an output that would mimic the response of a human. Contrasting this to what we find our Islamic theological scholars mentioning, there is actually a precedent for functionalism, for this philosophy. We have Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahimahullah, one of the great imams of Aqidah. He mentions in one of his books that performance of precise actions indicate to us that that entity or that agent that is performing them is in fact alive. In other words, if you see an action, i.e. the end outcome, the output, the result, and that just by virtue of observing that end outcome, if it seems that it is a precise enough action that would make you think that this entity that has produced this action is alive, then it can be regarded as being alive. And then likewise you have Imam al-Razi, who mentions that life, he defines life as an attribute by virtue of which knowledge and ability can obtain. So again, he too is just looking at the end result. If you see an entity in which possesses knowledge and ability, then you can make the assumption or the conclusion that this entity has life. However, having described this, there are drawbacks to these definitions. And one in particular is that we should also consider the idea of something that is alive to possess voluntary action, to have what we call irada or ikhtiyar, will, volition, the ability to voluntarily move. So here's a quote that shows the importance of consideration of voluntary actions, where I'm quoting from a handbook of comparative criminal law, in which it states, you don't have to read the whole thing, I'll just summarize it, that when an individual is sleepwalking and they commit a crime, they are not to be held liable because they don't fully possess voluntary action at that moment. So it shows to you that even in our society, outside of in criminal justice, that this idea of defining life or defining something by way of volition and voluntary action is something that is taken into consideration. And likewise, there's no difference found even when scholars of Islam, when they discussed life and its relationship to volition, irada, will, voluntary action. So I want to share a few quotes that kind of correspond the importance of consideration of voluntary action. Shihabuddin al-Khafaji, rahimahullah, says that life in animals, all in any animal, is an attribute that requires sense perception and volition. So, therefore, one of the great scholars of Lugha, he said that prominent Muslim theologians did not regard plants as being alive. Now, one can argue that biological life they have, if you want to define biological life in a different way. But the scholars of Islam were trying to capture a certain type of life in the sense that one that indicates to you certain characteristics, such as the differentiation between a plant and an animal. What exactly is differentiating between the two? And so they defined the regarded plants as technically being not alive, in order to differentiate the meaning of that they were trying to capture by what it means to be alive, especially when it comes to animals and humans. And since AI, strong AI, is trying to replicate human cognitive abilities, it only makes sense to use to try to see what type of definition they gave for such a life that mimics or is animal-like or human-like. Another quote by Imam Tahseen says that life required sense perception and voluntary movement. And then another one by Imam al-Kastari, where he says that there's agreement on ability and voluntary actions only being found in that which possesses life. And then finally, I want to conclude with Ramazan Effendi cites verifying theologians who define voluntary actions as specifically the ability to choose one of two equal actions over the other without any compulsion. And I want to draw your attention to this very last line here, that what is being considered as voluntary action here is not the mere ability of artificial intelligence to choose one of two options, but to choose without compulsion. In other words, if we are to believe that AI is being governed by a certain algorithm, would this qualify as being under compulsion or being voluntary? That is the point that is trying to be highlighted here. When it comes to AI machines having the ability to understand, a recent poll was done was asked of specialists in the field of how they felt regarding if they felt that AI could ever reach a point where it would understand natural language. Would it have such an understanding to do so? And it was a near draw. Nearly 51% of computer science specialists answered the question by affirming that they felt that there could be a point where AI does reach a level of understanding. Remember what I said about functionalism over here, the idea that what really counts is the end result, the end outcome, or the end output. I want to contrast that ideology with another ideology that was highlighted by a famous Western philosopher by the name of John Searle. John Searle had this thought experiment which he named the Chinese room thought experiment. The way it works is you have a man who does not know any English. He's inside of a room. He receives input in Chinese. And obviously he doesn't understand the symbols that he's seeing. However, he has a rule book in which the rule book will tell him that if you receive these symbols, then reply with these other symbols. So as the picture shows over there. And so whenever he receives an input, then he looks to his rule book to determine what is the output, and then puts that back to where he received it from. So essentially, what it seems like to any onlooker or outside, somebody who's outside of the room, is that this individual in the room, in fact, knows and understands Chinese. But the reality is that this man inside this room does not understand Chinese. And so the correlation that John Searle was looking to make was that this is in comparison to what we find in AI. That AI will receive an input and then look to see by its rule book to determine what is the corresponding or suitable output without having an understanding of the semantic value of these words that are found in the input. So John Searle's experiment, we have a precedent that we can find even within the books of Islamic scholars, where you have Sharif al-Jurjani, rahimahullah, he defines understanding as the conceiving of meanings uttered by the speaker. Notice how much of a corresponding definition is. John Searle was looking to make the point that this individual inside the room doesn't understand the utterances of the speaker in Chinese. And you have Jurjani here mentioning virtually the same exact thing. That understanding requires conception, conceiving of the meanings uttered by the speaker. So even by Jurjani's definition, this man in the Chinese room would not qualify as somebody who has understanding. However, having said that, generative AI doesn't work like classical AI. Generative AI doesn't just use if-then statements. Generative AI uses a predictive pattern recognition model. And this pattern recognition is unlike what was found in previous AI versions. However, I believe that the argument could still be made, even when it comes to generative AI's use of pattern recognition, that true understanding may not be there. Obviously, this is something debatable, but I want to put this out there. For example, we have some information provided by Islamic theologians where they said that true knowledge or understanding is a capacity by which one can distinguish between meanings that through attaining conceptions of those meanings and establishing relations between those meanings. So one would have to ask that if generative AI is using pattern recognition, is it really distinguishing between the conceptions and meanings and the relations between them? Or is it just pure pattern recognition? And I'll leave this out there because, like I said, this is something that's hotly debated. But I merely wanted to showcase that Islamic scholars were not oblivious to defining these terms. And these are scholars that lived 500, 600, some even 1,000 years ago. But this is something that they thought about. And perhaps during their time, it wasn't as relevant as it is today. Another thing that we find in the philosophy of mind is a thought experiment by Frank Jackson called Mary's Room. Mary's Room, this thought experiment works like this. You have an individual named Mary. She has learned everything there is about the color red. On a theoretical scientific level, she has all the theoretical knowledge about the color red. However, she lives in a black and white world. She has never seen red. She only possesses all that there is to possess regarding theoretical knowledge of red. So the question that is asked is, upon the first time that she ever witnesses red, does she gain some new form of knowledge? The idea is that most people would argue that she, in fact, does gain something new. That theoretical knowledge is not sufficient to understand or have a proper understanding of something. That it does require the actual experience, the conscious experience of that thing as well. And then once again, Islamic scholars also took this into consideration where they said, when it comes to understanding, understanding is a faculty within an entity by which the meanings of what it senses is truly realized. Again, tying in that what your senses perceive and then the meanings that are internally realized, that is what is referred to as understanding, not the mere theoretical knowledge of a certain thing. And then once again, another contemporary philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel, very famous, he has this discussion regarding what is it like to be a bat? What is it like for a bat to be a bat? And what he's looking to capture here is that every living organism has a certain subjective conscious experience that only it knows and recognizes. And that no matter how much you understand how a bat operates and how a bat functions and how a bat lives, there is an element that is missing to fully understand the experience of a bat, because only a bat knows what it is like to be a bat. Imam Ghazali also takes into consideration this definition for life, where he mentions that the lowest degree of comprehension of an entity, of an organism, of something that is alive, is where the perceiver has self-awareness. And so one could argue that, is it a case, can it be a case, again, I'm posing these questions almost rhetorically out loud for the sake of discussion and consideration. I'm not trying to make definitive points here. But the question that we can derive from Imam Ghazali's words and Thomas Nagel is, does AI have that minimum level of comprehension where it has a perception of its own awareness, of its own self? Does it possess self-awareness? Does it meet that lowest mark of what qualifies for a living organism to be considered to have comprehension, or does it not? And then I mentioned at the very outset of my talk that even in the field of neuroscience, this is something that is hotly debated. And just 8 weeks ago, there was a study released by neuroscientists from Europe on consideration of AI. Does it understand, or does it have self-awareness? And they conducted many experiments in regards to this, and they concluded in the very last paragraph in the results section that despite all of its abilities across sensory, motor, cognitive, social, and emotion domains, current AI remains unable to experience itself, including these various functions, as part of the wider world, as it lacks the being in time and being in the world, as based on the ecological layer of the point of view. So again, this is something that is not just secluded or just to Muslim scholars and philosophers, but it overspills even into other fields such as neuroscience. Now, one may ask that when it comes to our own beliefs, where do we stand? As many of you know, that we're not what is termed a physicalist or a reductive materialist, where we only see things from a material perspective and we don't look at that which may be metaphysical. Rather, as Muslims, we look at the physical as well as the metaphysical. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran here, إِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي خَالِقٌ بَشَرًا مِّن طِينٍ. When your Lord said to the angels, indeed, I am about to create a human being out of clay. فَإِذَا سَوَّيْتَهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِي فَقْعُوا لَهُ سَاجِدِينَ. That when I have proportioned him and breathed into him of my spirit, then fall down in prostration before him. Showing that the human is composed both of a physical body as well as a metaphysical soul. And that is what is known as dualism in the philosophy of mind, as opposed to what is referred to as physicalism or reductive materialism. What's interesting is that Islamic scholars went into great depth regarding the human soul. And they said, based on the available information, what it seems like to be the relationship between body and soul, or mind and body, is the fact that the soul is described as one of a governing or managing of the body. That the soul, in other words, is what gives it rationality. The soul is what gives it the ability to have the voluntary volition and will that we spoke about earlier in all of the definitions that we presented. And so that is where they saw these definitions being derived from the soul. Perhaps the most important theological consideration on this topic of AI and sentience is understanding what it means to create. In my brief survey of Muslims who, when I asked them, what exactly do you find problematic if one day strong AI is achieved? What would you find to be most problematic? And the answer that I received was that what then is the difference between what we have created in the form of AI and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates. But here we want to remind everyone of this important theological consideration that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, أَفَمَنْ يَخْلُقُ كَمَنْ لَا يَخْلُقُ أَفَلَا تَذَكَّرُونَ. Can the one who creates be equal to those who do not? Will you not then be mindful? Or Alhamdulillahi fatir as-samawati wal-ard, badi'u as-samawati wal-ard. In these ayat and many ayat like it in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although in English it's not readily clear between the definitions of create, originate, and innovate. However, in the language of Arabic, it becomes clear that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to here is what is known as creation in the meaning of ex nihilo, which means to create out of nothing. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking, is there anyone out there who can create without any prior material? Create from nothing. That is the question. That is what is meant when these verses are read. And so no matter how intelligent of a being humans are able to produce, or how quick the processing of a computer may end up being, the fact of the matter is that this is not the same understanding of khalq or badi' or fatir as mentioned in the Quran. So that is the remarkable difference between that of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by virtue of Him being al-Khaliq and everyone else in creation. Another important theological consideration to be made is that many have asked regarding the ayah in the Quran where Isa alayhi salam in Surah Ali Imran mentions that he will come and display an ayah, and the story is well known to many of you, I'm sure, where he takes and molds using clay, he molds a bird and then breathes into that bird, and that bird becomes alive. And so the question that many people are asking is that something that could happen with humans, where they can do the same type of miracle that Isa alayhi salam has performed? And what's important to understand from this is what is mentioned in the second ayah here, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, أَمْ جَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ شُرَكَاءَ خَلَقُوا كَخَلْقِهِ فَتَشَابَهَ الْخَلْقُ عَلَيْهِمْ قُلِ اللَّهُ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ الْوَاحِدُ الْقَهَّارُ. Or have they associated with Allah partners who supposedly produced a creation like His, leaving them confused between the two creations? Say, Allah is the creator of all things, and He is the one, the supreme. The marked difference between a mu'jiza of a prophet and the actions of a human is that the mu'jizat of the prophets are done without devices, without means. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enables the action to occur at their hands without any device, without replication. Whereas obviously, even if we were to propose the idea that AI possesses life, then this is done through some type of means, and that it can be replicated. In fact, many could replicate it. It's not a miracle in the sense of how we define a miracle being without means. And I'll touch on that in a second from a different aspect. Another question of theological worth is taklif, or what is known as moral accountability, or what we call mukallaf. When somebody becomes baligh, we say that this individual is now mukallaf. He has moral accountability, moral responsibility. From a standpoint of just mere rational possibility, without any consideration of ayat found in the Quran, other ayat found in the Quran, if the question is asked, could it be possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make a machine alive? And then not just alive, but alive to the extent that it would be regarded as being morally accountable. Then Imam al-Laqani here, he mentions that majority of the scholars of Aqidah held that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could place life in anything, even within a single atom, and even without the use of a soul, if He so pleases. Meaning, by virtue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Wallahu ala kulli shay'in qadir, by virtue of that, if it is a question of just mere ability, if He has the ability to do so or not, the answer is He has the ability. However, what the next question that is entertained is, although if He has the ability, does that mean that He is going to do it? That is a second consideration. And in view of this second consideration, the scholars seem to suggest that this is not something that He is going to do. Imam al-Alusi states that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally has a monopoly by virtue of being the creator over the secrets of the soul, and that the intellects of men hardly have the comprehension for it. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. They ask you about the ruh. Say, its nature is known only to my Lord, and you have been given but little knowledge regarding it. And then along the same lines, Imam Razi cites consensus, ijma', of the entire ummah's scholars, that which is going to be morally accountable, that which is going to be mukallaf, is limited to humans, jinns, and angels. And that animals and inanimate objects will never reach the capacity needed for such accountability. And they derive this from other verses in the Quran, and narrations from the Prophet ﷺ that seem to indicate this. One of them being the ayah of إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فَأَبَيْنَ أَنْ يَحْمِلْنَهَا وَأَشْفَقْنَ مِنْهَا وَحَمَلَهَا الْإِنسَانُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Indeed, we offered the trust, the amana. And the scholars have explained that amana here means taklif, moral accountability, moral responsibility. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He offered taklif to the heavens and the earth and to the mountains. But they all declined to bear it, being fearful of it. But humanity accepted it. And that they are truly wrong, that they wrong themselves and are ignorant of the consequences of this amana that has been placed upon them. So these and other verses they took into consideration, and they derived a consensus that which is mukallaf will be limited to these three categories. I want to conclude here, and if you want, you can use the QR code to ask any questions. But I want to make one final point of conclusion here, which is that one of the most important things to keep in mind is that the challenges of today are only going to increase. Today, we're speaking about AI. 15, 20 years ago, there was another topic that was highly contested, which was cloning. And prior to cloning, there were other challenges. And we can derive from the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ that these theological challenges will continue, and they will only multiply. And if that's the case, then it behooves us as a community that we do not just merely wait for the next conference regarding the next challenge. It's more valuable for you and your family that you become proactive in learning your deen, so that when the next challenge comes, your solution to that challenge need not be, I'll just wait for the next conference. Rather, you now possess the tools, the understanding, to understand your deen in light of those challenges, without having to constantly resort to others. It gives you independence. Knowledge gives you independence. It frees your mind, that you now feel confident about your deen. And as many of the students here can attest, that there is no greater feeling in this world when you see yourself becoming more and more confident in your belief in Islam. So we will conclude with that. And inshallah, like I mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will try my best to answer them. Okay. Is Dajjal's army going to be AI? It's a very good question, in all honesty. When we look at the narrations regarding the Dajjal, it seems very plausible that AI is going to be used by him and his minions. It's not far-fetched by any means, based on what we're seeing right now and what lies ahead. However, having said that, I don't think we need to go into a state of hysteria or panic. AI, as you've realized by previous lectures yesterday and today, can be utilized for great benefit for the Muslim community. And so it shouldn't be the case that we have this negative impression that just because it may be misused against us, therefore in its entirety it should be forsaken or not utilized for your own benefit. Rather, you would be only harming yourselves if you did such a thing. So it's important to keep a balance, but to answer the question, it's quite plausible. I think it is, in my opinion, based on the narrations that we see and the technological advancements that we're seeing before our eyes. Can you provide clarification on how angels are mukallaf, morally responsible? Although Imam al-Razi mentions here that he includes here angels as being mukallaf, the verified opinion, or what they call rajih opinion, is that according to most scholars of Ahl Sunnah, or the vast majority of them, the malaika are ghayr mukallaf. This is mentioned by Imam al-Bajuri in his commentary on Jawharat al-Tawheed, if anybody wants to consult it. But there is an opinion that angels to some degree have some type of accountability. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, so there's a question here. One second. Is there a possibility of transferring the memories of someone into a machine? I don't know, but as I mentioned here before, the scholars did say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the qudra to put life into anything He wishes. Life is not restricted. If we're speaking only from the standpoint of what is possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that if He wants to make a rock alive or a tree alive, He has the power to do so, even an atom. Many of the questions that I'm being asked here revolve around things that I would classify as outside of the theology. So I will just take one more last look to see if we have anything here. Yeah, many of these questions are just, they more so go into the ethical realm. What is ethical for us to do? And so that's outside of the theme of today's lecture, which is of theological considerations. So I think inshallah, we'll wrap it up here then. If anybody wants to ask any questions privately later, that's fine, inshallah. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.